Welcome to the program. This is Thriving in Business and Life, and I'm Will Wilkinson.
And I'm Christopher Harding. And today, Will, we're going to be covering a topic called quantum responsibility.
Well, it's the title of one of our chapters in the book, and I love the title, and I got to confess, True Confessions here in the morning in Ashland, Oregon, I don't really fully understand the term.
Well, that's what this chapter and program is going to be about. So how, in other words, how do you take responsibility and have it be responsibility squared, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, where my mind goes is it's like big responsibility, sort of exceptional responsibility. And I know, because we worked on the chapter together, that you mean something a little different than that.
Right, and so we're going to kind of unveil that a bit as we go. But if you think about it, one of the things that's probably the biggest challenges we run into in organizations is this difficulty they have sometimes really describing what is responsibility and what's accountability.
Right, and what's the difference between the two?
And what's the difference? And a lot of times when things go well, nobody has any question about who's accountable and who's responsible, you know.
Right.
It's like, yeah, I was part of that success. Let me tell you about
Happy to take credit for that.
Right, and when things go wrong, you know, then all of a sudden there's a real question about what those two terms mean.
Right, where's the bus and who can we throw under it?
Yeah. So one of the things that happens a lot of times when you start talking about responsibility is people will say, well, you know, Joe's the manager, so he's like 60% responsible here. And you know, Susan was on the team and was kind of a team lead, so she's like 20%. And all of a sudden you're carving up
Right.
100%. And
there's argument about the ratios. Right.
Exactly. And so, you know, you start to look at, you know, this whole idea of if responsibility is a mindset, which we've posited before, then if I see myself as 20% responsible for something, how much effort am I going to really put into it?
Right, 20% effort.
Right.
Probably.
And afterwards, my willingness to be accountable or take ownership, about 20%.
Yeah, unless it's really successful.
Right. Yeah, suddenly the whole dynamics change.
Yeah, that was my idea.
Yeah,
right.
so with that in mind, you know, you think about, you know, what are the ramifications of everybody functioning somewhere south of 100%. That means nobody's putting in their full effort.
Yeah.
So I want to share a case study. You're familiar with it.
Well, yeah, this is one of my favorite stories.
Yeah. So we've changed some names to protect the innocent and the guilty, for that matter.
But they know who they are.
That's right. Change the company names as well. But, you know, quickly, here's the setup, and then we'll ask our listeners to help solve the case in their own mind with us at the end. So what happens is there's a vice president of development and marketing named Jeff Miller. And Jeff hires this woman named Angela San to come in and head up an integration program to where she's now going to oversee the integration of both marketing and development, which have typically not always functioned at the best. They kind of have bias cycles operating about each other.
Right.
So he hires her. You know, she's, you know, seems to be really bright and so forth. He brings her in from another company, and not everybody's happy about her being brought in. This one gentleman named Robert, who liked to be called Bob, he was particularly unhappy.
What's his role in the scenario?
Well,
here?
he had worked in both the integration and marketing, and he thought that he'd been there for 8 years. And he thought, why didn't I get this role?
Right, so a little jealousy going on there.
Yeah, some jealousy, and he started to, you know, what happens when things don't go our way, start making up stories. His story was, well, they brought her in because she's a woman. They brought her in because she was younger. You know, he started making up a variety of stories, and some of his pals, you know, in the group were happy to form coalitions of disempowerment, you know, and support him.
And complaining about the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And that Jeff Miller, the VP, was, you know, just kind of a clueless, you know, person who was just trying to look good.
Right, and he just delegated to Angela and kind of walked away. Is that what happened?
Well, that's unfortunately, that is what happened. They brought Angela in. So she comes in, and things don't go well because she's getting no cooperation. Now the situation between development and integration is even worse. So at one point, the president of the division, Miguel, comes in and he goes to Jeff, hey, listen, this is not going well, and I want this to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And let's face it, there's a diversity issue as well here because we brought in a new person,
Right.
who happens to be of a different cultural background, and we've got to make this work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as time goes on, Jeff finally decides he's figured out a way to handle this, and he offers Angela kind of a side move to supposedly a lateral,
Ooh.
move, just to kind of slip her out of the way while he figures out what to do. Well, she goes, this is a total embarrassment. I'm not going to do this.
Right.
And so she gives her resignation
Oh,
letter.
wow, right. I remember now, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's pretty dramatic.
Yeah. So
And totally unexpected probably to Jeff.
Right. So as you take a look at this, when we got called in at that point to go in and help deal with this so that it didn't just completely blow up. So, in sitting down with all of the different, constituent parts, we posed some questions. Like, first of all, we wanted to test the leadership and see where they were.
If I can interject here, because this
Yeah.
just keeps coming up as I'm listening, it occurred to me that the scenario you just described is kind of like the setup for a TV series, where you get to know the characters.
Yeah.
You get to know their relationships and the problems, and then you get drawn into the soap opera, which goes on week after week,
Right.
season after season, and we kind of get addicted to the stories, but it's not resolving. It's just stories that never resolve. I'm making the point
Yes.
because you showing up with your team, an intervention really is the switch. I'm thinking like of a train
Right.
track switching from surviving to thriving. It could have gone on forever with that kind of soap opera, but you showed up and it's a chance to switch the story, right?
That's the opportunity.
Right.
Absolutely. And so in posing questions to them, and the listeners can see what they think might be the answer, the first question was, or you could pose it as a statement, the leadership, that would be Jeff and Miguel, are 100% responsible for allowing the uncooperative behavior of the resistant employees. So just think to yourself, do you agree with that?
Was this
Do you
posed as a
disagree?
question for everyone?
Yeah.
Very
So
interesting.
So they kind of write down their answer, what they think. Then the next question is, Bob, we're thinking about him now,
Right.
that the emphasis on diversity and bringing in employees of new tenure and different cultural background is responsible for him not getting the promotion to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So agree or disagree on that.
Uh-huh.
What do you think is the case? The third one is Angela
Of course.
is personally responsible and accountable for the decline in morale and productivity in the marketing and integration effort.
Right.
And the last one is, well, there's two more actually. Jeff Miller, who
Mhm.
hired Angela, is responsible for her resignation.
Right, because he hired her, it didn't go well, she's resigning, his fault.
Right. And Miguel, the president who told Jeff to do whatever it takes to make this work, was not committed to Angela's success.
Right, so this is an interesting scenario. I know when you were in the live situation, you were asking everyone, all the players, we're inviting our listeners to think about it right now.
Right.
And so how would you pose the question to our listeners right now, just in
Well,
brief?
it's really, when you say how are you going to divide up the responsibility here, that gets to the heart of quantum responsibility. If we kind of do a little bit of a shortcut, and there's two clues here. The first one is, and I share this every time we're working with this case study with other people. If you want to answer this in the way that supports people's victimhood, the answer is really easy. The leadership is not 100% responsible. They can't be 100%. That means no one else can.
Right.
All
or nothing.
Yes, of course, Bob is not responsible for not being promoted. It was these other causes, and no, Angela wasn't responsible for the situation because they set her up to fail. And no, Jeff isn't responsible for her resignation. He offered her a way out, and she didn't take it. And yes, Miguel was committed because he told him to do whatever it takes. Now, the challenge is, back to your point, all of those answers perpetuate the drama going on
Exactly.
and on. And whether Angela's involved or somebody else, that mindset.
Yeah. Well, I can add another one
Perpetuates.
to it, a phrase
Yeah.
I heard many years ago in business, that there's no personal failure, it's always system failure. And I
The
found that
system created itself.
yeah, so you could add that to the list and say, well, no, who's responsible? Well, the system.
Yeah. So when we're working with people, and we encourage this, if you want to help somebody who's trying to form a coalition of victimhood or disempowerment, one real quick way to do it is to say, well, which answer would make or provide the most powerful opportunity for the people the statement is about,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the first one is the leadership is 100% responsible for creating the environment
Yeah.
that allowed the uncooperative behavior. Well, disagree lets them off the hook.
Exactly.
They might be, wow, thanks for letting us off the hook.
Right.
Yeah, we agree. We're not 100%.
We like these consultants.
Or as my wife refers to it as insultants.
That's good. I haven't heard that before.
So, yeah, she's always coming up with new words. So the other answer is, well, what if you adopted the mindset of, yes, we are 100% responsible?
Right. Well, I know the objection to that may come up even for our listeners is, well, that lets everybody else off the hook then. Those are the ones who are 100% responsible,
So
which is
everybody
not
else
what
is-
you're saying. That's not quantum responsibility.
No, and so the idea here is there's a flaw in our thinking, is that we have to divide it
Yeah.
up.
Right.
And quantum responsibility this is where the leap is. It's a quantum leap in our thinking. Everybody has their own scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
In other words, if there's 5 people involved, there's 500%, because each person has the opportunity, at least,
Mhm.
to take 100% responsibility for their role
Mhm.
and how it impacts the others.
Mhm. So can you go back to the actual event, because this is a true
Yeah.
story for you. What happened when you sketched this out and invited them to take the leap from partial responsibility into quantum responsibility?
Partial, and in some cases, no responsibility.
Partial down to zero.
Right. Well, so the way to kind of help people through this is say, let's just play with this for a minute.
Mhm.
So we're gonna take it out of the realm of the intense and the serious and the drama, and say, let's just play with this for a minute. Let's just say, just for the heck of it, what if, Jeff and Miguel as leaders saw themselves as a mindset responsible for creating an environment that didn't allow uncooperative behavior?
Mhm.
What else would they have done in the situation?
Right.
Up front,
Uh-huh.
proactively.
Yeah.
Thriving is proactive, right?
Yeah.
Up front, proactively, to ensure that this promotion went well.
Mhm.
Well, gosh, maybe they should have talked to Bob.
Could have been a good idea.
And said, hey, Bob, you've been here a long time. Here's what we're doing. We're bringing this person in. Here's why.
Mhm.
Here's how we see your role. Here's what we see for your future.
Mhm.
So that he doesn't feel like, he's left out in the wild by himself, that
Well,
he's been
because-
totally ignored.
Because he was ignored.
Well,
he was left out.
Yeah. So, you start to do other things like, coach Angela, mentor, do some interventions along the way, make sure things are going well. There's so much they could have done. And so if I ask myself the question, if I'm willing,
Mhm.
that's an if,
Mhm.
to see myself as fully responsible for what I'm about to decide and do, what will I do
Yeah.
to ensure that this works?
What will I do differently now that I've assumed 100% responsibility?
Yeah.
What a question.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole scenario could have been very different. Of course, the question then is, will they learn and adopt quantum responsibility in the future?
Well, here's the beauty, though, is even if something goes wrong, and after the fact I decide to assume responsibility for what went wrong, and I realize, wow, I didn't really function at that level of responsibility going in, at least now I can learn from it. I
Yeah.
start to ask myself questions like, what would I have done if?
Well, I'm just thinking of these incidents that occur with large corporations. United Air has had some problems lately, United Airlines, and often the CEO will need to make some kind of statement.
Right.
And sometimes they say, well, this is my responsibility because it's my operation. which is admirable, but they don't go the extra step into quantum responsibility to indicate that it's everybody's responsibility.
Well, so let's roll down the list here. A great, point. Let's go to Bob. So if I were coaching Bob, and I got a chance to coach who we're calling Bob in this story, then the question for him is, well, Bob, if you assume that it was diversity or trying to get new blood into the scenario is why you didn't get the promotion, then who's responsible for your career and promotability?
Yeah, right.
Are you really going to hand that off to somebody else?
Great question.
And
what did he say, by the way, when you said that?
Well, initially it was just kind of stunned
Uh-huh.
at the question at all.
Because it hadn't occurred to him.
No. And so I just said, I wanna help you step into your power if you're game.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is, looking at this again, had you seen yourself as fully responsible for demonstrating your leadership so that another opportunity when it came up, they'd go, wow, that Bob guy was awesome in that last situation.
Yeah.
What would you have done differently?
Uh-huh.
Well, the answer is obvious. First of all, support Angela.
Exactly.
Pull together the team, be an informal leader that
Right.
really makes it work.
Right.
And how about go talk to Jeff and find out why you
Yeah.
didn't get it or
Yeah.
why he chose her,
Right.
rather than make up stories.
So when you sketched that out for Bob, did he get it?
Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah.
a big step.
Well, what happens is once we clear the muddy waters
Mm-hmm.
of dividing up responsibility and invite people out of disempowerment
Mm-hmm.
and just say, would you be interested in learning something that could help you be more powerful in this situation and going forward?
Mm-hmm.
Most people will say yes.
Yeah. Well, what occurs to me is that the real missing ingredient here is the shared commitment to a vision. Where why would someone take 100% responsibility? Why would Bob do that? Well, it would be because he was excited about the vision for the company.
Right. And it's really easy to say, well, they didn't let him know, they didn't cast a vision. Absolutely true.
Yeah.
And so do I want to be subject to leadership's potential incompetence?
Mm-hmm.
Or do I want to take my career and the future of the team into my hands to the degree I can and do what I can?
Chris, this is very interesting because I'm just thinking of a number of situations I've been in where there's been a dysfunction, a chronic dysfunction that
Right.
keeps getting played out. The names change, the situation
Right.
change, but it's really the same story, just like the serial TV shows I was mentioning.
Yeah.
On and on it goes. One episode, we even call them that after another. And I can recall the feeling of kind of intransigence that, things are screwed up and I sure wish they would improve. And the feeling of disempowerment, and you mentioned the term a coalition of the disempowered, often that is what the workforce becomes in a company.
Well, and it's a lot of great humor comes out of it. We kind of soothe each other, and there are times I'll share another story with you if we have time later where it is almost intractable and some other things are going to have to happen. But in this case, I think the most interesting conversation I had was with the person we're calling Angela.
Uh-huh. What was her initial perspective?
Well,
I'm sure she was upset.
She was upset. She was insulted, really, that they tried to, pass this off and appease her by putting her into this meaningless position.
Yeah.
And so she was upset. She was angry.
Uh-huh.
This wasn't the first time that this kind of thing had happened to her, where she was the odd person out and nobody knew what to do with her. In part because of her different background. She was, of a different generation than a lot of the people she was coming in to help guide or lead. And so in talking with her, I said, it's understandable that you're upset. I get that. And, it'd be easy to support you in saying you were set up to fail.
Right.
And she's looking at me like, yeah, and where's this going?
Yeah. Could we just stop there?
And I said, listen, you're a bright, powerful woman. I have the sense that you really don't like to inhabit a victim role.
Right.
And she said, absolutely not. I said, can we talk about, regardless of what goes on in this situation, what you could learn from this so that it doesn't occur again.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
So I just asked her the same question. If you would have seen yourself as 100% responsible for you saying yes and accepting the job, what would you have maybe asked before you said yes? And she stopped and went, oh my gosh. I was so happy about the role, and they did such a good job selling me that I didn't ask those kind of questions. I said, what would you have asked now, knowing what you know? Is there anybody else who thinks they should have this job? Have you spoken to them? You know, what are you going to do to prepare the way for me to step into this so people understand why I'm coming in?
Yeah. So the point you're making is to be proactive with the attitude of quantum responsibility.
Yeah, and then when she comes in, who's the first person she wants to get on her side? Bob, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Pull him in and say, Bob, I know you've been here for a long time. I want to really highlight you. I want to give you visibility. Let's figure out how you can be part of this in such a way that people really get to see you shine.
Well, I can imagine that happening in like a 5-minute conversation right at the beginning.
Didn't take long.
Where he could have become her best ally instead of her adversary, and the one who was galvanizing the team into a team of disempowered complainers.
Well, and the beautiful part was he wasn't the cheerleader for the coalition, but he sat in the center and said, "Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, it really was disappointing."
I think that's called misery loves company.
Yeah, kind of passive aggressive in a way. He wasn't doing anything necessarily overt, but he was kind of soaking in and marinating in the comments. So, as each person went through this, and sometimes people have difficulty with, Miguel told him to do whatever it takes. He told him he was committed to this working. Well, commitment is obviously more than words, right? Commitment means I will do what it takes. Right. And if I'm going to say I'm committed, I really need to check my mindset of responsibility and say, am I really?
Yeah. Well, what's occurring to me is a potential problem here. Could be there's someone listening and they like what they're hearing and they have a situation in their office, and let's say they have some authority, and they go, this is a good idea. And they go in and they say, okay, I'm taking 100% responsibility and you should do that too. You need to do that. Talk a little bit about that, because implementing quantum responsibility, if it's not done properly, it could be a you should kind of thing.
Right. Well, we all know what happens when we should on ourselves or others.
Yes. Right. Nobody likes that.
Yeah. So one of the things that we really suggest is, if you're going to implement something like this, that you really start to walk through it, a piece at a time, saying, what we want to suggest is a new way to look at responsibility. This is a way that's going to create clarity for each of us. It's actually going to provide an opportunity for each of us to become more powerful in doing what we do, and ultimately, as a result, having more fun together.
Yeah.
And then, kind of mapping out.
That's laying out a vision.
Really. Yeah, laying out a vision and showing, okay, here's the 100% scale for us as leaders.
Yeah.
Here's the 100% scale for, the manager. Here's 100% scale for employees. And then asking them, with 100% responsibility, what could you do to ensure this would work better? And sometimes what happens in the process is you start to realize that, well, the employees are feeling like their 100% is going to get held back by their manager.
Yeah, right.
Being evasive.
Right.
So it kind of starts to, a lot of times, unearth things, and it's just like, well, so what would the manager do if they were 100%?
So in other words, it begins to ferret out the pillars of dysfunction. What's been established probably for years, decades. I'm thinking of all the disempowered phrases people use, like, well, I only work here. That's not my department.
Yeah.
I don't have any control over that.
That's not my job description.
Yeah, and there's a lot of those, which indicate it's a kind of a chronic attitude for people who feel disempowered, likely because they don't have the authority that they think they would need to make changes.
And in another week, we'll get into the whole conversation of empowerment, because if you're going to ask people to step up to 100% responsibility, you also need to create an environment where they get to fully participate in their role.
Well, let's talk about the limitations to this, because I can just imagine some of the questions around this, like somebody takes responsibility, they get excited about this, but then they run into a budget problem, because from their standpoint, being 100% responsible would mean buying something that's not in the budget. Talk a little bit about the physical limitations that show up.
So part of that means if I'm going to make a suggestion that a new piece of equipment will resolve the scenario, being responsible doesn't mean just having wishful thinking and I wish money would show up in the budget. It means one idea would be a new piece of equipment. Mm-hmm. Let me go to my manager, supervisor, whoever's has the hands on the budget, and say, here's the situation. What can we do to make this work? Mm-hmm. Now, maybe they say, wow, that's not in the budget. Is there something else we could cut out of the budget? Mm-hmm. Can we help you do some cost savings so that we can pull that together? Mm-hmm. It may end up being that it's not in the budget this year, but it could be for next year.
Well, kind of a reverse version of this. I'm just remembering years ago, I moved to a new city. I was working with an international nonprofit educational organization, and I was setting up an office. I was very excited about it, and I was choosing lamps and tables and stuff, and I was, I think, in my early 30s, and this was a big deal. And I happened to mention to my supervisor who lived a few hundred miles away what I was doing, and he said, what's your budget for that? And I said, I don't know, $600-700. It wasn't much. And he said, well, why don't you submit that to the board? I said, well, why? And he said, well, probably that's something we should cover. And I hadn't really thought of it because I was so excited about what I was doing. I was just planning on paying for myself, and then I'd cover it I'd cover it with income that came into the operation because it was a small business. And I was taking full responsibility for it. And when he came back and offered that, and I did, and I got a check for $732 or something, I was so elated. I thought, this is fantastic.
Well, here's a danger with this, right? Is let's say I step up and I see myself as fully responsible. The challenge is if I start to either demand that my colleagues be the same way, in other words, I get self-righteous about it. What happens is people start to get resistant and turn against you, actually.
Yeah.
So the whole idea is, what can we do, everybody, to be more powerful in this situation? And if we can really approach it from that standpoint with people, it goes over a lot better than if we're shooting people or, look at me, I'm fully responsible. Look what I did.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the other issue, and I'm sure you've dealt with this often, is somebody comes into an operation with this sort of attitude. I imagine that can ruffle some feathers too, like quit being so happy, quit being so enthusiastic.
Well, that's true, and there's a couple of other pieces. Maybe we can pick them up next week. But we always like to end with a couple of our surviving to thriving items, and maybe we'll save a couple just in case we cover this again next week. But for example, one way of looking at this on the surviving side is that I create false dichotomies that force people into choosing between us and them. Who's to blame, in other words?
Yeah.
Right.
Versus thriving, which is encouraging a both-and attitude, which is a form of holistic thinking, as well as the notion that there just is no them.
Right. It's only us. And I mean, once we break down that default, you could say, approach that there's an us versus them, that if it's only us, everything changes.
Yeah. Well, I see our time is just about up here, and I'd like to leave listeners with a bit of a stretch for the week. Pick some area in your life and make a commitment to being 100% responsible. Move into quantum responsibility.
Absolutely. And just ask yourself the question, if I were to see myself as fully responsible, what else would I do, or what would I do differently?
Thank you for listening. This is Will Wilkinson. You're listening to Thriving in Business and Life.
And I'm Christopher Harding, and you can reach us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. Until next time, everyone.
See you next week.